Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we hear from Polish politician Radoslaw Sikorski, who has served as the Speaker of the Polish Parliament, the Defense Minister, the Foreign Minister, and is currently serving as a member of the European Parliament. Sikorski discusses the overall security situation in Europe, particularly in light of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and connects this to the need for a European military. While there have been calls for European security and defense identity and European military force for years, Sikorski outlines how this would operate independently of the NATO alliance, free from some of the national constraints that come with NATO employment. Sikorski makes the case that this is a matter not only of burden sharing, but also of the alliance members in Europe being able to take up and defend their own interests in a way that would be precluded if each had to do it independently as national entities, and which is more difficult under the auspices of the NATO alliance. This conversation was recorded at the University of Texas, Austin, but was sponsored by a student organization, and therefore the views are not those of the university, but those of the student organization and the speaker represented. Let's listen in.
Minister Sikorski started his career as a freelance journalist for outlets such as The Spectator and The Observer. Notably, he reported from Afghanistan during the USSR's invasion of the country. Later, the minister hosted a program on Polish public TV where he interviewed notable leaders such as Margaret Thatcher, Lech Wałęsa, Henry Kissinger, and more. In 1992, Minister Sikorski served as the Polish Deputy Defense Minister. From 1998 until 2001, he served as Undersecretary of State. In these roles, the minister helped Poland become a member of NATO and abolished visa programs with many countries. From 2002 to 2005, Minister Sikorski was a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. In this capacity, he organized many major international conferences. From 2005 until 2007, Minister Sikorski served as the Minister of National Defense of Poland, where he declassified many Soviet military plans and intelligence reports. From 2007 until 2014, Minister Sikorski served as a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. Minister Sikorski reformed, modernized, and enlarged the ministry. One of Minister Sikorski's main objectives was the improvement of Polish-Russian relations. From 2014 to 2015, Minister Sikorski was the Marshal of the Polish Sejm, the equivalent of the Speaker of the House in the US. In 2015, Minister Sikorski was appointed Senior Fellow at Harvard Center for European Studies. In 2019, the minister was elected to the European Parliament, where he serves as the EU's chair for relations with the US. Today, Minister Sikorski will be delivering a speech entitled "The Making of a European Union Military." It is my great honor to now welcome one of the most achieved Polish statesmen, Minister Radoslaw Sikorski.
Well, thank you very much for this fulsome introduction. My mother would be pleased. And hello from the depths of Polish countryside, where it's already cold. And best regards to Texas, where it must still be quite warm. I have been to Texas many times. My wife's family is partly from Texas, Houston. And I was there long enough to learn that everything is bigger and better in Texas. One of my most memorable trips was as Minister of Defense to take delivery of Poland's first F-16. There are here 48 of them guarding our sky against a Russia that's become aggressive again. Yes, we are speaking anniversary of the Soviet Union's stab in the back of Poland in collaboration with Nazi Germany, according to the Hitler-Stalin Pact forged 3 weeks earlier on the 23rd of August. Today, fortunately, Germany is our ally and our biggest trade partner and the biggest contributor to the European Union. But while we are meeting, we are all witnessing the horrible news from Ukraine. In Izium, the Ukrainians are discovering the kinds of pits with mass graves that to us in Poland are reminiscent of the pits at Katyn of our murdered officers, the total 20,000, as a result of that Soviet stab in the back and as a result of the dismemberment of Poland in 1939. This is the fate that Ukraine is defending itself against, and this is what must not happen ever again, either to Poland or any other European country. You've asked me to share with you my views on European defense. I don't think it's a time for speechifying, so let me just make my argument for European defense. I knew that President Putin was a dangerous man after he invaded Georgia, after he made speeches both at NATO summits and at the Munich Security Conference, portraying Ukraine as an artificial creation, perhaps not long for this world. And I was convinced he would invade already last year, after I read the essay that he published in July last year, and when I learned that he ordered all his troops to read that essay. I asked myself, why would he do that? Ukraine has done much better than, frankly, I anticipated. I thought that Ukraine would be overrun, at least on the far side of the Dnieper River, looking from Europe. But that Russia would lose in the end after a 10-year guerrilla war. Perhaps my experience of Afghanistan in the 1980s informed me here. Instead, Ukraine has won the Battle of Kiev, it's won the Battle of Kharkiv, and it's now pursued a successful counteroffensive. The Russians have lost in dead and wounded, perhaps between a quarter and a third of the invasion force. And the reputation of the Russian army and of Russian armaments and of Russia itself are in tatters. I am also pleased because they've exceeded my expectations, both the European Union and the United States. I thought that if Russia invades, we would impose some personnel sanctions, some trade sanctions, and at most cut Russia off the SWIFT banking system. We've gone much further. We have frozen Russia's reserves. We have imposed the toughest sanctions in the history of the European Union. And these sanctions may not have crashed the Russian economy yet, but they have certainly made it impossible for Putin to rebuild his military. And I'm very glad to say the United States has rallied round and done more than I expected. I think we were lucky that perhaps there was a perception in Washington and in the country at large that the withdrawal from Afghanistan last year could have been more orderly, and perhaps President Biden made the judgment that another fiasco would harm his standing in his own country. We were also lucky that an old Atlanticist, in both senses of the word, is in charge in Washington, because I'm sure there are Republicans among you, but I just have to remind you that the first impeachment of President Donald Trump was over the issue of President Trump making it conditional to President Zelensky American deliveries of weapons to Ukraine in return for dirt comments on his rival's Joe Biden's son. That doesn't sound like someone who was ready to help Ukraine withstand the invasion. An invasion by someone of whom President Trump said that he trusts Mr. Putin more than he trusts the FBI. So Ukraine is benefiting from European sanctions and macro financial assistance, which is important. So this Ukrainian state is functioning, and a huge American package of military assistance. I understand that that Congress has voted through 40 billion, of which something like 13 billion has already been dispersed. And I'm very glad to say that this has happened with bipartisan support. In my capacity as chairman of the EU-US delegation, as you mentioned, I visit Washington regularly. I was last there in August, making sure to see both Democrats and Republicans. And there are only two issues on which those two parties agree. One is China and the other is Ukraine. And actually they are related, because I think US congressmen and senators correctly think that if Russia loses in Ukraine, China will be less likely to try to grab what it regards as its so-called renegade province, namely Taiwan. So this is not only about Russia, this is also about China. Now, where does European defense come in here? It comes in because, first of all, the United States would like to see us spending more money on defense and carrying the burden of leadership, rallying round to help the United States, at least to secure Europe. And here I have to say all US presidents, including Donald Trump, have been correct in demanding that European countries spend more, and they are slowly increasing their budgets. Some slowly, Western Europeans, some rapidly. Poland is going from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP projected in the budget next year. We are on a spending spree. American tanks, drones, anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems, Korean howitzers, and so on. So first of all, defense is expensive. We need to spend more. But we should also prepare for a moment when perhaps either the United States, as a president who is more domestically focused and perhaps not as committed to the transatlantic relationship, and we know now that this is not theory, or perhaps that China becomes as cavalier as Mr. Putin, or as aggressive as the phrase wolf warrior diplomacy would suggest, and does something that threatens the American system of alliances in Pacific and East Asia. And we know that the United States no longer has the capacity to fight two wars simultaneously. So we in Europe have to be mindful of the fact that if something kinetic happens in Asia Pacific, the United States might not actually be able to help us to stabilize our own periphery. And as the European Union, we are the largest economy on earth. We should not be helpless in such a situation, both when it comes to a large-scale conflict, such as the one we have between Russia and Ukraine, or actually if it comes to a lower-order threat, say Libya going chaotic again, or perhaps Algeria resuming going Libya's way. We do not expect the United States to call on us to help you secure your southern border, which is also a challenge. And I think it's fair for us to be able to do it on our own in our southern periphery and not always call on the United States. And you can do it two ways, of course. You can do it by the European pillar of NATO, or you can do it as the European Union. The thing about the European Union is that NATO has certain rules which were perhaps all right in the Cold War, but are no longer good these days. For example, when you have a NATO operation, such as the one in Afghanistan, where we all rallied round to the United States for the first time in history, Article 5 was invoked. In a NATO operation, everyone is for himself. So you send troops and you also have to pay for them, which means that countries are reluctant to send the troops. And military contingents are national. NATO is an intergovernmental organization. And the trouble with Europe is that the threat from Putin is not all across Europe. It is concentrated on the eastern flank. So when you are Germany or France or Spain or Portugal or Italy or Belgium, you do not feel threatened by Russia, at least not in that visceral way in which we feel threatened as Russia's neighbors, Poland, Baltic states, Romania, and so on, Norway. And that means that the Western European countries are much less willing to spend money on their own defense. And we, in effect, end up spending 3% of our GDP in order to defend much richer countries who are spending 1.2, 1.3%. These look like minor differences, but these are large GDPs. So the differences in cash terms are in tens of billions of euros per annum. And I think it's just fair that all of Europe should contribute to the defense of the European Union from the Putin threat. And the money should be spent where the threat is, which is in the East. And that's why European defense, understood as the defense by the European Union, in my view, makes sense. It's fairer. It also would create new mechanism of decision-making. If Germany, as the Chancellor said in the last few days, becomes the largest military force in Europe, this will scare all of Germany's neighbors, because Germany is a little big for Europe, and it's the largest economy by far. So if, in addition, Germany also becomes the strongest country militarily, Germany's neighbors will be alarmed. The solution to this conundrum is for Germany to be a major contributor to a European force with a decision-making at the European level and not at the national level, so that we can all defend ourselves, contribute fairly, but Germany is secure for her neighbors, for Europe, and for herself. And I'm not sure there is enough willingness yet in the member states to go for such a system. We have created a defense budget, but it's small so far. Defense issues go to the core of national identity. And we are, remember, not a federation like the United States. We are a confederation where ultimate sovereignty lies in the member states. But there is a precedent. When the United States was fighting the British, you didn't join up your state militias. You created a new force called the Continental Army, funded by the Continental Congress and commanded by George Washington. I've made speeches in the European Parliament, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, asking fellow parliamentarians what kind of disaster has to happen for us to get serious about defense. I think this disaster is upon us, and therefore it's the last. We are actually past midnight, because defense systems take decades to develop. So if we started to organize ourselves today, we would actually only be ready at the end of the decade with the first systems. So I feel it's high time. We should create something that would help the United States by helping ourselves, by securing at least more seriously than hitherto our own continent. And that way we can ensure that the free world is secure from predators such as Putin and others. I'll rest my case here, and I'll be very, very glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Sikorski, for those excellent remarks. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to quickly thank the audience for submitting so many excellent and very interesting questions. It made my life a lot easier. So the first question is, has the EU tried to solicit funds from the US for this idea? And if yes, what has been the response so far?
No, we don't need funds from the US. As I've mentioned, we are the largest economy on earth. If you look at CIA's World Factbook, you'll find that the EU economy on the purchasing power parity is actually slightly bigger than the US. So this would be the spending of our own money. The EU budget is about 1% of total EU GDP. It's up to 1 trillion euros. From this budget, we have now made a defense budget. I'm afraid it's only 1 billion a year, but it will grow. It just should grow much faster than hitherto.
Yeah, I think the reason for that question is when people look at NATO, given that the US provides the majority of the funding, I think people have some concerns about whether or not the European Union military, the European Union and member states would be able to step up.
Sure, careful with this, because yes, the US is the largest contributor to NATO, but there are two aspects to it. Number one, the NATO membership fee, but everybody pays into that according to their own GDP. So the US being the largest economy, of course, has the largest membership fee. But what most people the US is also the largest spender on defense in general. But that's not on NATO, it's on its own defense. So the US has simply the largest military budget in the world. And here, yes, there is a genuine problem that Europeans have not been spending enough, but they are now increasing quite quickly. And we will be doing it both under the NATO heading and under the EU heading.
Was an EU military something you felt was necessary before President Trump threatened to withdraw the US from NATO? Or was that worry the catalyst for the idea?
I was in favor of it even before. And even before, we had a system called European battle groups, 3 battalions at any one time from 3 different countries. This has been the case for the last 20 years. And remember, the EU has already fought wars. We have EU forces all over Africa, Mali, Chad. We've hit Somali pirates from the air. We have a maritime operation off the coast of Libya. So this is not entirely new, but it's how you generate the forces and how you pay for them that I think should be improved.
Would an EU military have an Article 5 clause like that in NATO? If yes, would there be limitations on this? For example, would an EU military have an Article 5 type response if EU members attacked each other? If yes, how would they decide whose side to take?
No, come on. EU members attacking each other. Let's talk. Let's be in the realm of the possible. Yes, we have a solidarity clause in the Treaty of the European Union, which is actually stronger in legal terms. The obligation to help one another is stronger than in the NATO Treaty. Because the NATO Treaty is actually quite ambiguous. Most people think that Article 5 obliges you to go to war. It doesn't. It says an attack on one should be considered as an attack on everybody, but what measures each member state takes is up to that member state. And, it could be summoning the ambassador of the aggressor state and handing him a very tough diplomatic note, theoretically. So legally, the EU is already, the mutual guarantees are stronger. War between EU states is a really unlikely event because there would be so many measures that we would take before anything like that should happen. And remember, it's very difficult to join the EU. To join the EU, you have to adopt 80,000 pages of common legislation. Whereas NATO is just an alliance, meaning it's intergovernmental. These are quite different organizations.
Do you see a potential unified EU military as a replacement for NATO, or would it be something in addition to NATO?
No, look, even if we were to decide to get serious about defense as the EU, it would take us, as I've said before, 10 to 20 years to be able to stand up in a conventional force to a major power like Russia. So, for at least 2 decades into the future, NATO is absolutely indispensable, and probably far longer than that, because the transatlantic link is very valuable. So, as I say, the EU defense should be for lower order threats and for helping the United States to in its global leadership.
Yeah. Would an EU military sole purpose be to combat Russia, or would it serve other purposes?
We are not capable of combating Russia as the EU. At the moment, we do police-type operations, maritime patrolling, some, as I've mentioned, surveillance, some kinetic operations, but these are it's nothing like what the United States is capable of. These are low-order operations. The EU, for standing up to Putin, NATO is absolutely indispensable.
Is an EU military even necessary, given that Russia might be losing and is at the very least not winning its war with Ukraine?
It's true that Putin and his army have proved to be weaker than we thought, but his intent is worse than we thought, or at least as worse than some people thought. Look, the military is like an insurance policy. It's for scenarios that you can't predict. It's for events that you don't wish. It's like having preparations for a pandemic that you don't want to happen, but you should be prepared for, right? So we can't be absolutely sure, for example, that China will not help Russia, and therefore we can't not be prepared.
Does Russia's being a nuclear power and its potential to regroup and potentially improve its military going forward also play into the motivation behind an EU military?
Sure. I mean, as the EU, we have a nuclear power among us, France, of course, but with nothing like the arsenal that Russia has. France has something like 300 war, Russia has 1,000. But it's a factor. I hope that sanctions will stay in place on Russia for as long as she's a threat to her neighbors, and that should mean that Russia is incapable of rebuilding its army for as long as it has an aggressive leadership.
The next question kind of tries to cut a corner, but I think so many people so badly want it that I thought I would ask it regardless. Here it is. Would it be possible to admit a non-EU country into this newly created structure, like, for example, Ukraine?
It's theoretically possible. We do need an architecture that where us, the EU, could discuss and perhaps even act jointly with important countries on our periphery, such as Turkey and such as the UK and Ukraine, of course. I can also imagine that the European, the EU force would be open to volunteers from candidate countries. Or countries that have an association agreement with the EU, such as not only Ukraine but also Moldova and Georgia. This is entirely imaginable.
If we're going to entertain this idea of Ukraine being part of it, just hypothetically, would the EU potentially be worried about doing that because they would be worried about drawing themselves further into the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and potentially even sparking nuclear concerns?
Sure, we don't want a direct confrontation with Russia, just like the United States. There's a reason why the United States has not supplied Ukraine, for example, with the 300-kilometer ammunition to the HIMARS system, because the US doesn't want Ukraine to hit Russian territory, because that would be seen as an act of aggression by the United States. So yes, no, we want Ukraine to recover its own territory and stop there, which is why this is a proxy conflict rather than a direct one.
Would membership would being a part of this potential EU military be mandatory for EU member states? And if yes, do you think that the EU could see skeptical EU member states wanting to leave the bloc and thus causing further disunion?
It's not mandatory, and it can't be, because, as you know, there are some states inside the European Union which by treaty and by their own constitutions are neutral. Austria is neutral, Ireland is neutral. Anybody else? Finland used to be, but no longer. No, it's voluntary. It's like the Schengen system of a passport-free travel area, like the Eurozone. There are countries that are in Eurozone and others are not. Countries that are in Schengen, others are not. And this is another circle of integration to which you can belong, but you don't have to.
How would command and control be structured in an EU military? how would you and who would decide which generals from which countries would lead? And would the generals be subject to EU executive authority?
Well, we actually have an EU command structure already. We have an operations center, and we have the chairman of the EU military committee. What we need in addition is a joint headquarters. In other words, such as NATO has perhaps too many of. And we could, for economy's sake, we could actually take over one of them. We need a command center that can synchronize an operation on land, at sea, in the air, and perhaps in cyber and in space at the same time. This is very, the Russians are clearly not capable of doing it in the war against Ukraine, which is one of the reasons they're failing. But we should do it. We should do it properly, the military way. As regards the political oversight, we have a European Council for Foreign and Security Policy, where all the member states are represented, and it already takes decisions to launch operations. At the moment it operates on the unanimity principle, and there's a lively discussion whether we should go to majority voting.
How would the potential EU military balance individual members' security identities with that of a supranational security identity?
Well, I don't have to explain this to you in Texas. You were once an independent republic, and the interests of Texas were different from the interests of Maine or Georgia, right? So when you join a larger confederation or federation, it means you lose control over the entire ant, but you get the leg of an elephant. This is the compromise, and you're either willing to make it, be in charge of something much bigger, influential within it, or go your own way with all the consequences. That's the basic European deal from the very start of the European Union. By acting together, you limit some of your ability to do as you please, but in return, you get security and power of the whole grouping. And you have to. But we need to explain honestly to our people that this is the nature of the compromise. If you want old-fashioned type of state sovereignty, you shouldn't be a member, because it does require compromises.
This one is a bit of a broad question, but given your extensive insight, given that you're a member of the European Parliament and that you're one of the main proponents of this idea, or at least a big proponent of it, what are the couple of main policy obstacles to achieving this?
Well, the main obstacle is inertia. States have been talking the talk of common defense for decades. If you read the Treaty of the European Union as amended in Lisbon a decade ago, it's actually very eloquent about the need for common foreign policy and for common defense. But the question is, having walked the walk, are we willing to talk? Have we talked the talk? Are we willing to walk the walk? And I think it's high time. Because we have real enemies, we have real war crimes, we have real European cities being bombed. And we can't pretend that this post-Cold War nirvana, eternal peace, is still with us, because it's not. Weakness encourages aggressors, strength deters. And we need to get stronger than hitherto, because we failed at deterring Putin to invade his neighbor.
I know that you mentioned during your you said it wasn't speechifying time, so I'm hesitant to call it a speech. But during your address, your remarks, that the support for this is kind of mixed throughout the EU. Have you noticed a trend that those who tend to be in support are those from EU member states that are most threatened by Russia and often share a border with Russia?
Actually, no, because we have nationalist governments in, for example, Poland and Hungary, who are quite viciously anti-EU, the governments at the moment, and they are ideologically all over the place. You know, they on the one hand, they say the EU should be just a free trade area, so a kind of European NAFTA, right? But at the same time, the EU should be defending, should be spending money, should be building infrastructure, should secure energy supplies, and so on. Well, free trade areas don't do that. If you're willing the ends, in other words, the EU behaving like a serious center of power, then you have to will the means, which is that it requires certain constitutional arrangements and certain compromises on your ability to act as you please. But the nationalists don't have, they want contradictory things at the same time.
Yeah. So we have about 13 minutes left. Oh, now about 12. I have gone through my whole list of questions. So luckily I enabled live questions from people just on right now. So I'm going to quickly read through those and just ask some of the most interesting ones.
Sure, I can see them. You mean in Q&A?
Perfect. Then you can go. You can, if you would like to pick them, then that's completely up to you.
Sure. Well, Alexandra Moib, I hope I'm not mispronouncing, is asking how much leverage Russia has against the rest of Europe besides its control on energy. Well, leverage. Russia does have some influence. Russia has been pumping out its propaganda for decades. Countries were tolerating Russia Today and Sputnik and cyber aggression. But actually, energy is the main thing. The truth is that Russian gas has been somewhat cheaper historically than Norwegian or Middle Eastern gas, and some countries got hooked on it through the system of pipelines. We are now weaning ourselves off it, but you can't do it overnight. And at the moment, prices are high, and both European consumers and European industry are suffering. But I think if Putin thinks that he'll break us, he has another thing coming. He thinks he will bring us to our knees this winter. I think he won't. I think Europe will bite the bullet, and we will conserve energy. We'll pay a bit more, but at the end of it, Russian oil and gas industry will be ruined, just like Russian defense industry is. Nicholas Stenseng asks about the Putin problem. Do you anticipate a post-Putin and whether tensions with Russia will ease if Putin departs? It's hard to see how Putin will depart, because someone would have to terminate him with extreme prejudice, as you say in your American movies, and it would take probably one of his bodyguards to do that. So even though there is widespread dissatisfaction in Russia today, there is actually no other way of getting rid of Putin, because under the Soviet Union, the Politburo could gather and vote the leader out, as happened with Beria and with Khrushchev. Today, theoretically, absurdly, of course, Putin is the democratically elected leader of Russia. So there is no body that can remove him from office. But I think he is the hardliner. It's his war. I think he decided on it with a very narrow circle of other hawks, against the wishes of the majority, even of this authoritarian Russian establishment. So I think if he were removed, the war party would be discredited, and we would get a more cooperative leadership, or at least a leadership that would want to stop this war, either from inside the regime or someone from outside. The trouble with Putin is that he's completely discredited. Therefore, his removal is both a desirable outcome of this war, but also a precondition of any peace, because we can't trust his word or his signature for 5 minutes. How does Poland view its neighbor Hungary? Well, first of all, we used to be members of Hungary, neighbors of Hungary historically for many centuries, and even briefly in the 1930s, but no longer. We love Hungary, but they have a pretty corrupt and not entirely democratic government. Viktor Orban is a great disappointment to me. He attended my college at Oxford on a Soros scholarship, and he seemed like a decent Hungarian Democrat. But he's now constructed a system in which all propaganda channels are dominated by the government, state resources, the judiciary are all subjugated by the ruling party. And that's not the kind of system I was fighting for against communism. So, but Hungary is in trouble. The European Commission might decide as early as tomorrow to stop the flow of European funds to Hungary for the reasons I've mentioned. Sobir Komilov is asking about NATO retrieving its raison d'être. Absolutely. And Turkey having a problem with another EU member, Greece, which is actually also a NATO member. And remember, they were admitted into NATO simultaneously because of the problem already back in the 60s, I think it was. I think without NATO membership, we would have had a few Turkish-Greek wars in the last half a century. So I don't propose to solve the Cyprus issue for you, but I just hope that NATO channels at least help to manage that seemingly unsolvable conflict. Anonymous viewer, what are the most cogent arguments you have come across from opponents arguing against the EU military structure? Well, it's not to me to make my opponents' arguments for them. And actually, you don't need to make the arguments because, as I say, the inertia is what acts against what I'm proposing. I suppose some people are fear that if EU defense is strengthened, that would be at the expense of NATO. I don't see it like that, but the British fretted about it, and it's. But then they took this nationalist view and left the EU. What would the potential transfer of power look like in an EU command and control center? Would positions be term limited? Nicholas Stensing is asking. Well, all appointments in the EU are term limited. And the relationship between the EU Council and the NATO command would be, I suppose, similar to that between the National Security Council of the US, or perhaps the Senate of the US and the Joint Chiefs, more or less. Magdalena Ornat, could you please develop the idea of procurement for the EU military? Will it be restricted only to the participating nations? That's basically it at the moment. and we mostly buy American anyway. There are huge savings to be made in research and procurement, at least of the emerging technologies. Drew Vessels, in the long term, will the European Union be likely to shift their renewable energy goals to meet the short-term energy needs? Yes, absolutely. Because of Russian energy blackmails, we should and we will accelerate our energy transformation because the Russians can't stop wind blowing or the sun shining. Isabella Zatorski, do you want the United States to play a role in the creation of this EU army? I don't use the term EU army because that suggests the joining up of national armies, which I don't think will happen. And sure, the United States could be very helpful, but the whole point of it is to let the US devote its resources to other theaters. So this should be an EU effort. Harrison Keller, do you think the EU will path toward more sustainable energy infrastructure due to Russia-Ukraine conflict? I think I've already answered that. If so, what infrastructure do you think the EU will invest in? Well, the EU is already investing in infrastructure. We're also mandating infrastructure. For example, we forced gas companies to store more gas for the winter. We've already built gas interconnectors between EU countries. What we need is gas pipelines from Spain to Morocco, from France to Algeria, and in general, pipeline capacity between Southern Europe and Africa. I think if we could build photovoltaic farms all over Sahara and have that energy, use that energy to make hydrogen and then transport that hydrogen to Europe, everybody wins. Africa wins, Europe wins, Putin loses. Great. Rajit Gulhati, given Poland and Hungary's recent disagreements with the EU, how realistic is it that they would join in a supranational EU-wide military organization? Well, under the current governments, of course, nil. But I wouldn't call them disagreements. I mean, Poland is clearly in breach of EU rules. Poland is not fulfilling the judgment of the European Court of Justice and is paying €1 million per day in fines for that. And both countries have been excluded from this huge recovery fund that has an important energy transformation component because of breaches of rule of law. So no, nationalists will not join in a supranational arrangement. If Poland, if the original EU countries were run by nationalists, the European Union would never have been created. And if Poland and Hungary had governments such as today's, neither country would have joined the European Union. Our nations have to decide whether we want to be members in good standing or whether we want to do what the British have done. Because in the end, if you want old North Korean style of sovereignty, you can't be a member of the EU. It's as simple as that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.